Thank you, Rosie. We really appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Stacy Spencer. Really thank you for joining us today. I am the coordinator with the Confidential Advocacy Program, and we are excited again to be joined by Ayana Wallace of Ujima Community for part 2 of her presentation, Anger, Sadness, and the In-Between, Exploring Trauma Reactions as a Means to Reframe Narratives about Black Women Survivors. There we go. Okay, none of our presenters have anything to disclose today. And I'd like to acknowledge that the land that OHSU sits on in Portland, Oregon, and in Multnomah County is the original land of the Cowlitz, Multnomah, Clackamas, Clackamas, Tumwater, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Wascow, Molalla, Watlala, bands of the Chinook, and other Indigenous nations. And we acknowledge the painful history of genocide, and we commit to honoring the original people of this land. If you're not in Portland, Oregon, I really encourage you to find out what land you occupy and then make a donation to an Indigenous organization during the Thanksgiving week to support Indigenous communities. Thanks again to EdCom and Language Services for providing closed captioning and also Spanish translation and ASL interpreters. I believe Paul put in the chat the link for closed captioning as well for folks that would like to utilize that also. Now, before I introduce Ayana, I'd like to quickly share additional information about CAP and our services. So CAP's mission is to center the voices of those who have experienced sexual misconduct, discrimination, and harassment at OHSU through education, advocacy, empowerment, connection, and support. Our work is centered in social justice, intersectionality, equity and inclusion, self-determination, safety, and health. And we assist OHSU members who have experienced these harms by providing advocacy, emotional support, safety planning, information about reporting supportive measures, and educating our OHSU community about best practices when supporting survivors. Our department can provide you with information and options so you can make the most informed decision about what you need to feel safe and supported. We also have a 24/7 support line to assist OHSU members who need to access CAP services. During regular business hours, all support lines are transferred to our Portland office. After hours and on weekends, the support lines are transferred to community-based advocacy organizations in the area that you are calling from. If you'd like to speak to someone during the presentation today, you can call our support line to be connected with Stephanie, who is CAP's program director. And you can also contact our office by emailing capsupport@ohsu.edu. If you'd like to get involved with CAP, you can volunteer with us. Our volunteers play a really important role in supporting CAP's mission. Volunteers can provide direct service advocacy, assist with administrative tasks, such as refining our policies and procedures, participating in Rising Voices tasks, providing marketing support about our events and services, and then doing outreach. If you'd like to learn more about what becoming a volunteer means and the training entitled with that, you can email volunteercap@ohsu.edu. And I'd also like to introduce to you our survivor-centered initiative, Rising Voices. Rising Voices amplifies the stories, experiences, and ideas of those who have experienced harassment, discrimination, and/or violence that impacts one's experience at OHSU. CAP works to implement the identified priorities of survivors to address, stop, and prevent harassment and discrimination. To date, the Rising Voices initiative has submitted 56 policy recommendations to OHSU to propose solutions to address the institutional systems, programs, policies, and procedures that negatively impact our members who have experienced harm. CAP is committed to advocating for all members' rights to be upheld and to amplify the voices of those most impacted by discrimination and harassment. And again, if you'd like to join this initiative, you can email us at capsupport@ohsu.edu. And we also have additional webinars from our series on our website, and we really encourage folks to continue learning how to provide culturally responsive and trauma-informed best practices to support and uplift of the voices of those from historically marginalized communities. And again, I'd like to introduce Ayana Wallace from Ujima Community. Ms. Wallace has worked for over a decade in the domestic violence field. She has been instrumental in the national implementation of the lethality assessment program and has served as the lead trainer for the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. She has extensively studied the theory and implications of privilege, oppression, and intersectionality. She is a writer, a poet, an animal advocate, and a mom of 2 fur babies. Welcome, Ayana.
Thank you so much. So hi, friends. Good to see you again. Thank you for joining. If it's your first session, welcome. Welcome to the space and to our community. And I definitely just threw myself as part of your community because I feel it. But I really had a great time with you all last time. I thought you were really insightful. I thought you did a really great job of leaning into the conversation. And so if you were here last time, can you put a thumbs up or some reaction so that I can see how many new folks we might have? The reactions are at the bottom of your screen where you would find the chat box. Okay. Okay, cool. So good amount of folks that were here last time, maybe some new folks. Again, welcome. My name is Ayana Wallace, and I am the training manager with the Ujima Inc. team. Ujima, we are the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community. So one of very few nationally designated culturally specific resource centers. And so our work, of course, centers on the lived experiences, needs, realities, barriers, strengths of Black women and girls and of the Black community as a whole. And so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Again, I'm not ignoring anyone. I have our faces minimized so I can only see a few folks at a time. But if you have anything that you want to add, feel free to always add it to the chat or to take yourselves off of mute. I think everybody should be able to do that. And if not, raise your hand and we'll figure that out. But this is sort of our part 2 of She's Too Strong. I told you all we were going to talk a lot more about advocacy. We're going to look at trauma. We're going to look at just some basic principles that we can all use in our work when we're doing social justice work, and when we're really doing anti-racism work as well. So I entitled this workshop Anger, Sadness, and the In-Between because a lot of folks, when they think about trauma, they tend to think, oh, someone's going to be depressed, or oh, someone's going to show up and they're going to be really angry. But there's a whole myriad of responses and a whole wide range of responses that someone can go through. Someone could be angry one day, someone could be upset, someone can go through a couple different reactions within a time frame, and that's all normal. So we really want to think about and normalize trauma responses, and also really think about how we can show up for folks and really show up as the best allies and the best advocates as we can. So let's go ahead and, again, disclaimer, even though we talk about trauma, even though we do anti-violence work, even though we talk about survivors all the time, this stuff, it can bring up trauma reactions. And it's normal, it's natural, but take care of yourself in whatever way you need to. So if you need to grab a snack, a blanket, step away from your computer or go away from your computer or whatever you need to do, feel free, and then come back and rejoin the conversation when you're able. I also wanted to remind us of our workshop agreements. So again, you all were a really great group last time, but remember active listening, please, as long as we're in this space and as much as possible, put aside any distractions. Those emails can wait, hopefully. Be present, silence that internal chatter. So really absorb what's being shared in the space together. It's a really great opportunity to learn from each other and even learn from lived experiences in this space. Be open, push through your growing edge. Remember that everyone in this space is coming from different backgrounds with different understandings about language, with different understandings about history, and even culture and how culture is expressed and all that. So really make sure that we're pushing through our growing edge, being open, and then also really respectfully challenging each other if the challenge does arise. Lean in and lean out. So I always say lean in, like this is the perfect time to do it. And then the most important, to continue to have these conversations, because again, there's no point in us setting up these wonderful trainings if the information and the conversation just stays here. And of course, you all have the option, if you want to expand, elaborate, question any of these, put it in the chat and we can do that as well. And before I jumped into today's content, I wanted to also offer space for anybody that wanted to pick up or circle back to last time, that had some thoughts, maybe had some questions, some things they've been thinking about over the last week, or some new information they really want to share with the team. Like, this is the space to do it. And I'll give you all a few minutes or so. And again, take yourselves off of mute or put it in the chat or however you want to say it. Sure. So the question was if anyone had any follow-up from last session that they wanted to bring up. So any questions, any thoughts they didn't get to share that they want to share now, anything new that they learned that they think the group would really benefit from hearing or from learning about, share it. All right. I don't see anything. If something does pop up, I'll acknowledge it, of course, but we're going to go ahead and jump into our content then. And just a gentle reminder, folks, feel free to turn on your cameras, feel free to engage in the conversation as much as you are comfortable, but also push yourself. So you all know that I always like to take a very intentional moment to honor Black women throughout the diaspora, especially as we talk about trauma, really, when we talk about anything. For me. So this is an excerpt of a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks. It's entitled To Black Women. And I'm just going to read it and then we'll jump into our content. Sisters, where there is no cold silence, no hallelujahs, no hurrahs at all, no handshakes, no neon red or blue, no smiling faces, prevail. Prevail across the editors of the world who are obsessed, self-honeying, and self-crowned in the seduced arena. It has been a hard trudge, with fainting, bandaging, and death. There have been startling confrontations. There have been tramplings of monarchs and of other men. But there remain large countries in your eyes. Shrewd sun, the civil balance, the listening secrets, and you create and train your flowers still. And so I do see a comment, to be in a group that discusses these topics, I need to be in a group that also supports intersectionality. And I think that's really important to acknowledge and affirm and understand intersectionality, and not only what that means for safety, but what that means for rapport, what that means for community, what that means for mutual respect and understanding. Intersectionality is a really important concept and sort of theory to practice thing that folks really need to get into, because it's really great to, again, understand how complex a person can be and how beautiful that complexity is. I saw another comment. I learned more about how the strong Black woman stereotype, while seemingly positive, is reductive and does not embrace the complexity of Black women's identities and experiences. Appreciate that comment. And again, feel free to keep adding, but let's go ahead and jump in. So I will preface this entire workshop by saying that, again, my background is in women's and gender studies. It is not in neurobiology. I did not do brain science. That's not my zhuzh. But the more I've learned about trauma and about the brain and just simple functioning, not the easier it's been for me to stay in this work, but the more willing I've been to stay in the work, because I've come to understand certain reactions aren't necessarily, like, it might be about me, but it's not really about me. a lot of it has to do with simple, normal, natural responses. And so when I take that and I can also look at it with my own lived experience, with my own trauma reactions, and even to think about how those trauma reactions carry over into the work, like that's why I always like to sort of take a moment and really think about and talk about trauma. And also to really be able to reframe mental health and reframe trauma for Black women, for Black community members who usually we don't get to talk about those things. Or again, folks fall into tropes. So they see an angry Black woman instead of seeing someone that's literally terrified and afraid for their life, right? So we'll get into that. I saw another comment after the last session. I leaned into learning more about the fuller story of Sally Hemings and Reese Taylor in order to better understand my previous version of history, of where my previous version of history differs from the truth. I appreciate that, right? Like it's a whole, all of this stuff, all of this social justice work, anti-racism work, pro-Black work is really about learning and unlearning a lot of stuff. And so I really appreciate folks who, again, have been letting all this work sink in and really been taking the next steps to learn a little bit more, push themselves a little bit further towards a deeper understanding. So we're gonna go ahead and watch this video clip. It's the first one here. This was actually a great way for me to actually, when I was in shelter, I would show this clip every now and then to survivors. When I found it later in my work, I didn't have it in the beginning, which I really would have benefited from. But it's actually a great way to think about and understand, again, very simple baseline understanding about the brain and what happens when you experience something that is potentially traumatic. So we'll watch it together and then we'll do a quick practice session and review. So.
Now, you probably know the name Dan Siegel. He's one of the giants in the field of interpersonal neurobiology, and Dan came up with a lovely hand model of the human brain. So let's kind of go through the hand model of the brain. And this can be useful for you to understand, but at times it might be useful for you to actually share this with your client. The wrist, the forearm coming up to here, is like your spinal cord. And right here at the end of the wrist is like the base of your skull. And here, the bottom of your palm, this is like the reptile brain, the life support system of the brain. So, you know, if the rest of your brain is wiped out through, say, for example, a stroke or a car accident, this life support part of your brain, the reptile brain, can still keep your body alive, can still keep all your organs functioning and your breath and your heart and so forth. And this is where a lot of autonomic nervous system operates and stems from this reptile brain. Now, above the reptile brain is the mammalian brain, often called the limbic brain or the emotional brain. So reptiles, they've got the fight or flight response, or they've got the freeze, shut down, flop and drop response, but they don't really have anything that is even remotely close to the complex emotional states that we see in mammals. And the limbic brain has many different parts to it, but two in particular that we'll be looking at in this course are the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, don't worry about memorizing those terms for now. We will revisit them later. But this kind of is the middle brain, the limbic brain, the mammalian brain, basically responsible for emotions. Now, on top of the limbic mammalian emotional brain, you've got the cerebral cortex, the thinking cap of the brain. The cerebral cortex is much thicker in mammals, but especially so in primates, and particularly so in human beings, more so than any other primate. And this cerebral cortex, the thinking part of the brain responsible for consciousness and cognition. And right at the front of the cerebral cortex, you have the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right up here at the front of your forehead, above your eyes. And particularly important to us is the medial prefrontal cortex, this bit in the middle, right at the front, this bit up here. This plays a very important role in mindfulness and awareness. So let's just go through it again. You've got your spinal cord, you've got your reptile brain. Underneath your cerebral cortex, you've got your mammalian brain with the amygdala, the hippocampus, responsible for emotions. And then you've got your cerebral cortex, your thinking cap of the brain on top, and the medial prefrontal cortex right here in the center at the front, right there.
Okay, so we're gonna do a quick practice. Do not panic. It's not graded. It's just a quick practice. I always feel like it helps. So go ahead and make a fist and hold it up, or relax on something if you want, but have your fist up. And note that the two mammalian examples were male. Yeah, we can deconstruct all of that, but I appreciate that. So make a fist, hold it up, and we're gonna do a quick exercise that goes over, because I know when I watched the video the first couple times, immediately when they started talking about hippocampus and amygdala, I just tuned out. So at the base of our fist, what brain is this? Simple explanations. What brain is this? Who remembers? Our lizard brain. All right, our reptile brain, absolutely. What is it responsible for?
Making sure we stay alive.
Yeah, there we go. So a couple folks said it. Making sure we stay alive, making sure we keep breathing, not fight or flight, not there yet, but we're getting there. So basic functioning, absolutely. So it's not the best way to think, not the nicest way to think of this, but again, if someone is in a serious car accident or suffers a stroke, for instance, their lizard brain is not as functioning as well. So their ability to breathe, life support goes out the window. Then we have our midbrain. It's in the middle of our palm. What brain is this also called? It's our limbic brain. What else? It had like 3 different names.
The hippocampus.
The hippocampus is in there, but it's also called our mammalian, our limbic, or our emotional brain. So that's in the middle of our brain, midbrain. Remember that. We said hippocampus. What other part is really important to remember? There's really 2 parts to remember: the hippocampus and the what? Amygdala. There we go. So hippocampus and amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for our fight, flight, and freeze responses. That's our danger alarm, really. It's also very much responsible for our rage responses, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So then the hippocampus is responsible for filing and retaining memories. It's 2 big responses. So fight, flight, or freeze, or rage response, or the ability to retain memories. And so then we have sort of the cap here. It's called our cerebral cortex, or our thinking cap is the way I always just say it. It's our thinking cap. It's the easiest way for me to remember it. That way, when folks say they flip their lid, thinking cap, so your ability to reason, your ability to rationalize, to process, to be aware goes out of the window. You sort of flip your lid. So those are the main parts of the brain that are especially important to remember, because when you understand those things, absolutely has to do with emotion control and why folks might go from 0 to 100, or seemingly go from 0 to 100, or why folks might show up in some really strange or bizarre ways in certain spaces. I've had incidents where, and this is why it's important to be sort of scent neutral in different spaces, but I've had incidents where a scent, it might have been like a diffuser was going in an office. I had a survivor walking back to my office to talk to me. They got to my door and immediately turned around and like almost ran down the hallway. And so I sort of went, we talked about what happened. You know, you're really eager to see me. I know you were excited. What was that response about? And she said, well, that literally was the scent that like my dad had in his house every time he would beat me, right? So like certain things that might seem very neutral or even very pleasant to us might actually spark or trigger a trauma response. And so, again, it might seem really strange or really weird or really just off, but it's absolutely a normal and valid response. So let me go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, and so this is also a relatively quick clip that goes a little bit more into the sort of the natural hormones or the natural drugs that are released in your body that also influence how trauma responses will show up. And so we'll go into it and we can unpack it a little bit because I actually sort of really like this clip in particular.
So during a traumatic situation, there are two basic neurobiological processes that we're interested in looking at. One is what hormones are released and how does that affect behavior during the assault and the immediate aftermath of the assault. And then what is happening with respect to the memory of that traumatic event. Most survivors are going to have one of four main stress chemicals released in their bodies, or some have multiple hormones and chemicals released at the time of the assault. One of which are going to be the catecholamines. Catecholamines are like natural adrenaline. It's what pumps your body up in a traumatic or stressful situation that would help a survivor be able to fight back against the attacker or try to flee from the situation. Another hormone that's often released for survivors during an assault are the corticosteroids. And those work in conjunction with the catecholamines to determine how much energy is available. So again, for some survivors, they have a lot of energy available to fight back and to flee, and they stay very pumped up after the assault. But some don't. It sort of bottoms out and flattens out on them, and they might freeze during the assault, or they might be in kind of a stupor almost after the assault. Other hormones that affect the behavior at the time of the assault are opioids, which is like natural morphine. So some survivors during the assault report feeling like they're almost drugged, that they're out of it, and then when they do first responder interviews later, they have no affect. They're just describing it with no emotion, no affect, like they're reading out of the TV guide. There's just nothing to them. That's the opiates. The opiates help block physical pain, which you need during a traumatic situation, but they also just keep blunting everything, okay? The other hormone that's sometimes released is oxytocin, and this is a hormone that promotes good feelings. And that may sound strange. Why would you have a hormone that's about good feelings released during a sexual assault? Again, it's about trying to block the pain, the physical pain, the psychological pain. So the body will release opioids, natural morphine, to try to tamp down the physical pain. And sometimes it will release oxytocin in conjunction with that to try to balance it out. Hormone that promotes good feelings, hormone that tries to blunt pain. Again, it's just trying to mitigate the pain of this assault. But if the oxytocin levels get a little high, sometimes survivors might laugh, giggle, smile, engage in socially appropriate behavior that's socially inappropriate given that situation. So those are the four hormones that can affect the behavior during the assault. And these hormones are really instrumental in blocking the physical pain, helping the body react to the trauma of the assault. Now here's the kicker. Those four hormones, very helpful in so many ways. When those four hormone levels are very high in the body, it interferes with other structures in your brain that are trying to lay down the neural mechanisms of the memory. So it's one of those times where our body's kind of working at cross purposes. Those hormones are really helpful for fight, for flight, for mitigating the pain, but they cause cellular damage in two key structures of our brain that work to lay down a memory. What we've learned from the neurobiology of trauma research is that the memories of traumatic events are stored in a very disorganized way. When a survivor sits down and tries to explain to either a responding officer or detective what happened in the assault, and it starts coming out in this bits and pieces fragmented way of they start one thing, but then they stop abruptly, and then they start talking about something else, or they start explaining it very generally, and then they start throwing in random details, it can be very confusing for law enforcement. And a lot of law enforcement, based on other training they've had, will look at that and say, this looks suspicious to me, because it seems like they're making it up as they're going along. They're not making it up as they're going along. They're having difficulty recalling the different pieces of the assault because of the way the trauma of the assault affected the way the memory is laid down. So for law enforcement, they see this completely disorganized, discombobulated presentation and they say, I'm not believing this. This seems made up to me. What they're really seeing is evidence of trauma. What they're really seeing is how trauma impacts memory formation and then memory recall. So I think it's important for law enforcement to keep in mind that when they see that really confusing stop, start, disorganized presentation, to think about that what they're seeing is trauma. What they're seeing is a survivor trying to reach into the different pieces and parts of their brain and all the different fragments of that memory, and they're doing their best to put it together and to give it back. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that the research is very clear that the accuracy of the memory is intact. So even though the storage is fragmented and can come out kind of sounding confusing and in bits and pieces, the actual recall, accurate. One way to explain how trauma affects memory is with a simple example of Post-it notes. Let's say that listening to this interview, you were trying to write down the information. And let's say rather than a nice tablet of paper, all I gave you was a Post-it note, a little tiny Post-it note. And that all you could do was write down the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. Well, depending upon the size of the Post-it note, you might be able to get a few words written down. You might, if you got a good sized Post-it note, you might be able to get several sentences down. Or if you got a good sized Post-it note, you'd be able to write many, many different things, okay? Now I want you to imagine trying to write down all the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. And I want you to gather them all up and I want you to take them to a desk, the world's messiest desk, because that's really what the human brain is. And I want you to take all these little precious Post-it notes that have your notes on them, and I want you to scatter them all over the desk. I want you to put some on top. I want you to stick some underneath in the pile. I want you to put some in the interview that's about sexual assault. I want you to put some that says policies and procedures manual, obviously misfiled. Scatter it everywhere. Now, imagine trying to come back to that world's messiest desk 24 hours, 36 hours, 3 weeks, 6 months later. Find all of the Post-it notes, get them, put them in the correct order, and tell it back. That's what we're asking survivors to do when we're asking them to recall a traumatic event, when we're asking them to tell their story.
Okay, so any feedback or comments? I saw a couple of things come through in the chat. I love that video. I think it's a really great way to explain trauma and why sometimes when folks are storytelling, it just might not make sense. Because I know when I'm even trying to remember what happened last week, I have a difficult time putting the story together. So it's really even more difficult when you experience something traumatic. You might have been just trying to survive in the moment, and then you're being asked to retell your story. And so here's just another quick example, really another way to sort of think about how and why it's important to lean into understanding trauma and not fall into tropes, because someone's trauma reactions could be incredibly and like drastically different from their normal everyday disposition or normal everyday like presentation. So here's my quick example. So I don't know if I mentioned, but I'm a twin. My twin sister is the exact opposite of me. She is very petite. She's shorter than me. She's lighter than me, has big curly hair. She is very talkative, very outgoing. She's like the feisty one. She loves a good debate. And in my normal, everyday, non-trainer life, I'm like actually a very, very shy introvert. Like growing up, I wouldn't even order pizza on the phone because I didn't want to have to talk to a stranger. Like I was very, and I'm still very shy. So exact opposites. So we go on a sister's trip. It was really a work trip that turned into a sister's trip. She was able to go with me. We went to Chicago, and on work trips, I tend to go to sleep pretty early just because they just are very draining for whatever reason. So I'd gone to sleep pretty early that night. She was up on her computer doing some work, and it was like 2:30 in the morning when she suddenly and very roughly nudged me awake and was like, Ayana, wake up. And I'm like, what's going on? Why are you waking me up? Like, I love my sleep. I love naps. I just love all of that. I love rest. And so I take it very seriously, and she knows that. And she woke me up. So I knew something was wrong. She was, Ayana, someone's trying to come in through the adjoining door, like right there. Someone's trying to come in right now. And I'm like, Morgan, you're tripping. Like, you're probably tired. You're making this up. But then I look over and the doorknob is literally jangling because someone's trying to come through the adjoining door. And so instantly from out of my sleep, I'm just enraged. I am so pissed that someone had the audacity to try to come in our room at 2:30, waking me up in the process. I was enraged that someone had the audacity to try to attack me and my sister. Like, I had a whole story created. So I get up, I'm putting my clothes on, putting my shoes on, wrapping my hair up because I'm ready to fight. And that's all I'm focused on. And then I notice it's kind of quiet and I look over and my sister, who's normally the feisty one, normally the first one out the door, is just very calmly and quietly sitting on the bed doing nothing. And I'm like, Morgan, get up. Like, we have to fight. What are you doing? Somebody's about to come attack us. And she's like, Ayana, I don't know what to do. And I had to pause and think back. She's always been like that. She's always frozen in dangerous situations. And she's always sort of just let me take the lead in those situations. So what I told her to do is, I'm like, Morgan, call hotel security. Just handle that. Meanwhile, I'm pumping myself up. I'm like jumping up and down like a boxer, like I can fight. I don't fight. That's not who I am. But I was totally prepared to do it. And so hotel security, to their credit, actually came up very quickly. They went next door, they handled it, they came back to us, and they sort of explained that the person assumed it was the bathroom. Like, yeah, the door with like the triple locks and the double door is the bathroom, sure, but whatever. We ended up just quieting down. Everybody was supposed to go back to sleep and just chill for the night. So we go back, we shut the door, the hotel security leaves, and my sister just very peacefully and calmly goes to sleep. And I'm up, I'm pacing back and forth. I can't calm down. I have so much adrenaline in my body. I was up probably for the next like 4 hours until it was really time for me to get up to go to work. And so to think about me and my sister just knowing who we are, knowing our everyday normal disposition, knowing I'm an incredibly shy introvert. I really don't like controversy. I really don't like confrontation at all. And knowing that that is my instant response, and to know that that's not really something I can control all the time. Like, yes, people develop self-control, but that has to be modeled and that has to be taken into account. And so that was my relatively quick story about why it's really important to think about trauma responses and not just take it personally when a survivor might act out towards you or even cuss you out, because that's happened to me plenty of times. And it was really the trauma. They might have come back and apologized the next day, like, I really don't know what happened. And we were able to have a conversation about trauma responses and about how I could support them in those moments. So again, to really narrow in on trauma reactions and not blame the person, but also to do some modeling and do some accountability and support as well. And so that gets us to really thinking about polyvictimization and the language and the concept of it. So polyvictimization refers to having experienced multiple forms of victimization or multiple traumas, such as sexual abuse, physical abuse, bullying, and exposure to family violence. The big reminder for when we're thinking about polyvictimization is that the definition itself emphasizes experiencing multiple forms of victimization or multiple layers of trauma rather than multiple episodes of the same type of trauma or the same type of victimization. So it's a difference between experiencing sexual abuse, physical abuse, and bullying versus repeated incidents of sexual violence, if folks get that. And so, especially when we're thinking about and talking about then the relationship with intersectionality and polyvictimization, we sort of see how those things can go hand in hand, but we'll get into it a little bit more. So, question for the group. What type of traumas may a survivor experience before interacting with your program? So before even touching base with you, what or touching base with your program or meeting with you in any office space, what type of trauma might a survivor experience before even getting to you? And feel free to put it in the chat or take yourselves off of mute. So we know domestic violence, we know sexual violence, natural disasters. That's something that a lot of folks forget about, but it's really important to touch on. What else? Traumatic interactions with law enforcement, historical trauma, generational trauma. Feel free to expand on those and give some examples for folks. Health difficulties or health disparities, combat trauma, absolutely. Again, interactions with law enforcement, being trafficked, dating violence, bullying, experiencing and living through poverty, absolutely. What else? When you're not believed by providers, houselessness or housing instability or homelessness. It doesn't even have to be street homelessness. A lot of folks think it has to be street homeless to be traumatic. Absolutely not. Sexism, racism, yes. What else? Families where trauma is passed down, who might project their trauma onto younger generations. Food insecurity, that's a big one that folks tend to forget about as well. Yep, so historical and generational trauma experienced by Native Americans, absolutely. When we think about forced relocation of any type, border crossings, even when you have valid documentation, can be traumatic. So there are a whole bunch, again, of different types of traumas that folks can experience and live through polyvictimization before they even come to you or before they even meet their partner that is now doing them harm. Lack of disability accommodations, absolutely, or infrastructure. It was really, and we'll get into this about how folks are re-traumatized, but I remember a survivor in particular who was deaf and from a different country. And so folks had not budgeted properly to make sure she was going to be able to get the services she needed. So there were a lot of extra hurdles that she had to jump through to really get services that should have been applicable to her. And it was a re-traumatization. It's not only re-traumatization, but further traumatizing her for having to experience that systems gap that could have been avoided. Poor elder care, absolutely. So if anyone ever gets the opportunity to be in a space with Tanir Kane, go to a presentation that she's facilitating, absolutely take it. She is amazing. She is an amazing survivor advocate who talks a lot about her experience, not only having lived through systems and systems violence, but also a great deal of polyvictimization. I don't want to say she's a great example, but she's a really solid example of what polyvictimization looks like and the impact that it has on survivors. And so we're gonna watch this clip. Again, when we're talking about trauma, when we're watching these clips, please make sure you're taking care of yourself. But we're gonna watch this, we can unpack it together. Otherwise, we'll keep going with our content.
Well, as a child, I was sexually abused, married off to an older man at a very young age, experiencing domestic violence. I was a victim of neglect and abandonment by my mother. So I was always treated like I was worthless. And this is how things supposed to be happen in my life. And I needed to find a way to cope with my reality. I mean, at age 9, I was experiencing sexuality that you're not even supposed to. Who do that to a 9-year-old? Moving into foster care, taken from foster care by my mom, just so she can marry me off to an older man who beat me constantly. I needed to find a way to cope with that, or I would have killed myself. And I used drugs and alcohol to do it. Unfortunately for me, it introduced me to different public health systems. In a mental health institution, I was always thrown into seclusion. One of the worst things you can do to somebody that's a victim of neglect and abandonment. One of the worst things, because that's how I was always treated by my mother. And now you're gonna do it? So when someone come with their tray of medication or tray of food, I smacked it out of my face, because the only thing I know to do is to tap into my survival mode, because no one has taught me to do anything different. No one has identified, addressed, or treat my trauma, so I do the only thing I know to do, and that is to tap into my survival mode. And my survival mode has always told me to fight, because I didn't know there was any other way. So I did what I had to do to cope, and sometimes somebody might got hit with the tray when I smacked it. So now they're calling a code and they're throwing me down to the ground, restraining me, a rape victim, holding me down and restraining me. Somebody that has been held down and raped multiple times, doing more harm, causing more trauma, but because my chart says that I'm a crazy crackhead, the stigma, that's what they go by. That's what they go by. And unfortunately, I was re-traumatized, taking me even further away from the possibility of healing and recovery. I was a desperate child, still trying to tell somebody what happened to me. Still trying to find somebody safe enough to tell what happened to me. You know, we go to these facilities and they give us these tidbits of good information, but most of us have so much trauma packed so tightly, the bits and pieces of information can't get down there to get rooted. We got to get the stuff out of us so we can get the good stuff in us, so we can change our belief system, because once our belief system change, our thought process change, and we start to make the best decisions in our life. We can't do that if you still believe that we're a crazy crackhead. 2004, I was in prison with my daughter, and I was terrified I was about to lose another baby. I didn't know how I was going to do that. And they kept telling me about a program that addressed your trauma and help you with your addiction and your mental health. I said, well, I'm all those things, and I'm pregnant. And but you know what? I still didn't really have that. I didn't have high hopes. I did it because I wanted to keep my daughter. I didn't do it for anything else, because they sent me to so many different programs, one where I was court ordered and the drug counselor raped me. So how do I believe that anything would work? Really? You court ordered me to a program where I graduated and I was doing well, and then when I went back for aftercare, the counselor raped me. So I really didn't have high hopes after 19 years ago in and out of the systems that I could do better, but all I could see was me trying to keep my daughter. And when I walked through the doors of Tamar's Children, somebody said, I'm so glad you're here. After 19 years of people shaking their head in disgust at me and just saying, you're just a crazy crackhead, and hurting me over and over again, somebody told me they were glad to see me. And yes, they did. They dug deep and they worked with me one-on-one to help me to deal with what happened to me, not what was wrong with me, but what happened to me. And they did it right, and it was a one-stop shop, because understanding that I was homeless, they made sure I had a housing grant. They made sure somebody was attached to the housing grant that came out and visited me once a week to help me to create a budget and make sure that I was taking care of the property and my daughter. And I was okay with that. Some women say, oh, they all up in my business. I needed somebody to be up in my business. And they weren't judgmental. They understood. And they helped me, truly breaking the cycle, because that's what the real picture is about. Yeah, treat my trauma, or, remove the stigma to keep me out of your system. Yes, love that. But did you know that doing that was going to break the cycle for my daughter? She would be able to be given what she was given as a result. So we look at a whole different path from here on out for my daughter and her kids and their kids. I got to understand that it's a lot to do with what happened to an individual and how people were raised up or trained up. And then I could understand my job is try to educate them to remove the stigma, to understand the impact that trauma has on the individual. So instead of taking it on that, oh, you guys are awful. Well, don't get me wrong, I tell them when they're awful though. But I also know that where there's breath, there's hope. Where there's breath, there's hope. Everybody has room to get better. I'm a living proof of that.
So again, if you ever get the chance to be in space with Tanir, take it. I think she has a whole length documentary. I think it's still available on YouTube. It was, but it's entitled Healing Mean, and I'll put it in the chat. And it goes a lot more into a story and just really thinking about not only the multiple layers of interpersonal violence she experienced, but the multiple layers of systemic violence that she experienced as well. I know there was one story in particular that she told where she had actually been engaging in survival sex, that she had been assaulted by several men in a back alley. Then when she came out of the alley, she went onto the street and she saw a police car. And so she flagged them down reluctantly because she had many, as we saw, many incidents or interactions with law enforcement. But she flagged them down, and when they got out, they instantly recognized her and said, "Oh, Neen, we've been looking for you. We have a warrant," and slammed her up against the car and actually broke her nose right after she had been gang raped. So to think about, again, not only those multiple layers of violence that a survivor can experience before they even interact with you, but then what types of violence are they experiencing by virtue of the fact that they have to engage with whatever system. And so when we think about trauma and how it shows up, like we're able to generally list out a good amount of how trauma can show up, right? So we'll always mention anxiety and depression, avoidant behaviors, and avoidant behaviors can be tricky because just because someone is exhibiting avoidant behaviors doesn't mean that they're not wanting to be engaged in whatever's happening. So I had plenty of survivors. And so my process for case management, I would set out my schedule on a whiteboard at the beginning of the day. So I would let folks know if I had a scheduled meeting at a certain time. Otherwise, folks would just take a marker and put their name into whatever slot fit them best. So I had certain survivors that would come literally every morning, sign up for a certain slot. And by the time that slot came, they wouldn't show up. And so when I would call them, check in and say, "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" It wasn't that they weren't engaged. It was just so much going on. Or the fear set in. I had a survivor that had been street homeless for literally 35 years. And so when she actually got her housing grant and moved out of shelter, I got a call from her new case manager who was saying, "Hey, so-and-so isn't showing up. What's going on? Are they not wanting to be in the program? It seems she's uninterested." So when I called her to say, "What's going on? You were really excited about this. We have a plan. You have a plan. You have things that you need. Are you missing certain? Are you not feeling safe?" Sort of safety planning and checking in. We ended up having a long conversation about the fact that she had been street homeless for 35 years. And now she's just given this place. So how can she expect it to just be permanent, right? And so sometimes avoidant behaviors are a little bit more tricky, but they're really important to, again, tap into. Attachment problems, affect dysregulation. So that's that whole 0 to 100 thing that folks talk about. Hypervigilance, somatization. That's when a survivor, and it happens all the time, where belly aches and belly troubles and aches and pains, where they might be going to the doctor. And I found this to be especially true for Black women and especially true for older Black women, where they would go to the doctor and the doctor would say, "Well, there's nothing really wrong with you. You must just be getting older, or you must just be overweight." Where really, when they started going through therapy and through their support groups, those aches and pains and those belly troubles started going away. So it's important to remember that trauma literally manifests in the body, and which is why folks are getting more into talking about things like ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, rather. Because they have some deep, long-lasting, and sometimes very medically based impacts. Numbing Dissociation, we see dissociation oftentimes or at many times with child survivors of sexual abuse, where they might not feel connected to their bodies or they feel sort of removed from their body in certain spaces. Substance abuse or use as well as a coping mechanism. Oppositional behaviors. And again, a lot of this can be based in bias, but it's often, or it was often the case that survivors, especially younger survivors coming into shelter, had already been labeled as having oppositional defiance disorder, where when they were interacting with me, with all the authority that I had, that was not the experience at all. And so really to think about how oftentimes for Black women as well, there are a lot of diagnoses that are pushed on survivors when it's really trauma and it's not actually things like, oppositional defiance disorder, things like that. And then sexual behaviors not typical of age groups. So again, why it's important to talk about the adultification of Black girls and the trauma that lasts there, and then how behaviors might present as being grown or being hypersexual when that's really, again, trauma. Oh, and that other question, how does it really show up? It was really to emphasize the fact that a lot of times, again, something might show up as just very weird or very petty even. I know in shelter, there would often be fights over the remote or fights over folks moving people's laundry, but it wasn't really about the remote. It was about something else and something deeper. It wasn't just about, hey, don't touch my stuff, and them being mad about their stuff getting touched. It's sometimes about, this is all the stuff I have for the next 3 months because I left in the middle of the night with a trash bag full of clothes. Like, those are legitimate responses. And so to be able to talk to folks and get them, whether they understand it or not, be able to have a deeper understanding about the trauma and about their responses to it, that's why you talk about trauma, not to blame or shame or anything like that. And then next question, how are survivors further or re-traumatized when receiving services for DV or SA or stalking or any type of nonviolence service work that we do? How are folks getting re-traumatized through these processes or when interacting with these systems? And again, put it in the chat or take yourself. Yeah, so having to continuously retell their story, that can absolutely be re-traumatizing. And not only retelling your story, but then having people pick at it, right? And ask questions and sometimes even seemingly try to trip you up to see if you're lying or see if you're telling the truth. Not being believed, labeling, physical exams. Yes. In shelter, I repeatedly complained and pushed back against having to do drug tests in our domestic violence shelter. We are not the police. Like that is not, like, we're not your employer. Like, that is not what we're there for. But the way I tried to get around it, at least, was to inform the survivor at the very beginning that's something that was required for housing. They had the option to do it or not, and it wouldn't impact our relationship or the services I was able to provide them. If they did have a criminal or drug record, as much as they wanted to explain it so we could write a whole reframe a whole narrative for them, right? So to think about if there are certain policies in place that are harmful, how can you maneuver around those things, or how can you sort of sidestep them as much as possible, or legally even, to be able to get the survivor what they need? So we said things like physical exams, labeling, not being believed, having to continuously retell their story, having to fill out extensive intake forms or complete them in one sitting. I see a comment, because service providers have power and often access to certain services, you have to provide a lot of invasive information. For example, with emergency financial assistance, absolutely. Really, we're a lot of times asking folks to give their entire life story and their family and friends' life story. Like, we do a lot of investigation into, oh, well, can you stay with the family and friend? Oh, why not? Oh, they have food stamps. Well, can you give that? Like, there's a lot of pushback to survivors, even when we're trying or seemingly trying to do things in their best interest. but to understand that a lot of that is really re-traumatizing. Even something simple like working with survivors to fill out their housing history was, for a lot of folks, really difficult because they were bouncing from couch to couch, or they were bouncing from family to family, or literally running from their abuser. They didn't remember the exact address. And so having to go through and pick apart and retell that story was traumatizing, even though they might have wanted to do it because that was the only way they were going to get housing. So another comment, some providers will lie to pressure a person to do what they want, to do what they want to, or feel unsafe. Yeah. So again, we have to think about what's in the best interest of the survivor and not really what's easy or best for us as advocates and as allies. And Patricia Collins, again, one of my favorite people, just prime, perfect work, says oppressed groups are frequently placed in the situation of being listened to only if we frame our ideas in the language that is familiar to and comfortable for a dominant group. This requirement often changes the meaning of our ideas and works to elevate the ideas of that dominant group. And so for me, when I think about how survivors are even able to tell their stories, my office was always a cuss plus zone. Like, say it, drop those F-bombs, cuss as much as you want, we'll turn the sound box on, just so you can get your story out, just so you can tell me how you're really feeling, just so you can tell me what you really want in the language that you need to use it, or the language that feels comfortable for you at the moment. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to have a conversation about, hey, when you go to social services, maybe don't drop those F-bombs because they might take it this way. Like, we can still have that conversation, and I can still make sure that you're able to express yourself and tell your story and tell me what your needs are without me stopping you because the language itself is uncomfortable, or me stopping you because cuss words are something icky to me. Like, that's not really important when we're thinking about advocacy. When we think about advocacy, it's always centered on what are the survivors' needs and what can we do as advocates to support those needs, or support and fill in those gaps. I see another comment. I find it frustrating when married clients file for housing resources, even within our own program. They have to provide financial information for their spouse until they're actually able to leave. Right. So again, it's really important to think about what policies and practices are in place and what can really be changed to take out a lot of those barriers for survivors and to not re-traumatize folks as much as possible. And so we've been talking about this all along, but really, again, the relationship between polyvictimization and intersectionality. Intersectionality at many times can mean increased vulnerabilities for folks. So again, to think about the intersections of poverty, physical and mental health disparities, the criminal legal justice system, housing, IPV, or intimate partner violence, how all of these things may exist in someone's life, and what that means for their experiences of violence and their experiences receiving services and help as well. And so we've seen in the Black community, and we've talked, and folks mentioned it, generational trauma, folks mentioned family trauma even, but we've seen in the Black community with multi-generational trauma together with continued oppression and in the absence for opportunities to heal or access benefits available in society has resulted for many, not all, in the Black community in post-traumatic slave syndrome. And I have another, this might be the last clip, but another clip. Dr. Joy does some really great work. It has some really great literature as well, but a really great look into and quick look into post-traumatic slave syndrome and how it might show up. And again, why it's really important to narrow in on trauma reactions and not just chalk it up to, oh, they're the angry Black women, or oh, they're the matriarch, or oh, they're the Jezebel even.
slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed, no help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. So I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. All of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You socialize. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information,
they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
Yeah, I'll make sure you all get the links. I know the captioning was really blurry on the video for some reason. Apologies, but I will make sure you all get the links to these clips. Yes. So yes, Dr. Joy's work is really great, and also just a really good glimpse into how trauma can impact entire communities, and to really think about how it shows up in communities, and even the relationship between trauma and things like community engagement, right? So I might have mentioned last time, if you've never had a conversation with folks across the country, Black folks across the country, about why a lot of folks don't say picnic, there's a whole racialized history behind picnics and farms and state farm fairs, wheels, things like that. Preakness, I'm thinking, from Baltimore. But there's a whole history behind a lot of the language and behind a lot of specific events. And so to really understand those histories and understand the trauma that might have resulted from those incidents is really important. And I love this quote here: "To be anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness." And so we at Ujima, when we think about social justice work, we always say that it's not mission drift. Because domestic violence work, you have to do racial justice work. You have to do homelessness work. You have to do food access work, mental health access work. Like, all of those things are all tied in. And so especially when you're doing nonviolence work, to be anti-racist is actually a radical choice in the face of history, in the face of how we've been socialized to view people and how we've been socialized to dehumanize people, especially people of color, and especially people of different cultural backgrounds. And so us at Ujima, when we think about social justice, it's for us a step further to say, or really it's, you have to move a step further from just being anti-racist to being pro-Black, because there's a difference between being anti-racist and being pro-Black, and they show up in different ways sometimes as well. So 2 questions. What does a good ally look like, and how do they show up in the work? And I'll read this comment as folks are filling in the chat as well. I find my high melanin content brothers in the military have difficulty opening up about their traumas in combat. It takes definitive understanding and genuine caring to get them to release that trauma and move towards healing. Absolutely. Again, I loved what Tanir says. We have so much trauma packed down so tight, right? Like, there's so much layered trauma that someone could experience that it takes a lot, like trauma work and mental health work. And this is not easy stuff. This is not light stuff. This is, you're not going to heal someone's trauma in a week or heal someone's trauma even in a year. Sometimes it can be lifelong battles with healing and growth. I remember I did a ride along with a police officer. His name was Officer Luke. I'll never forget him. He was super nice. But he was new to the force, and he was a young white guy, super attractive, like fit all of the different boxes that we went over last time of like being the norm. And we were out together for a couple hours, and we just had a conversation about like, well, when you pull up at a scene, do you think about trauma? And he said, no, like that's not even something we conceptual, like that's not even something that's taught to us. And so I said, well, do you ever, after a really hard incident, like, what do you do to address the trauma? And he said, again, we don't do that. Like, we're first responders, we respond. We don't have to, like, those touchy-feely things, like, we don't do that. Like, that's something you might get from a mentor on the force, but like, that's it. And so again, I'm sure that's changing now because people are really pushing it. But to think about how you be a good ally, how you can be a good ally, you really have to be able to understand, like Carol was saying, how do you uplift the voices of folks who haven't been heard? How do you center folks who, where again, if you're closer to the norm, how are you then centering folks? How are you making sure to elevate the challenges that you might be seeing on the ground level, doing the, the direct service work? Being a good ally means oftentimes actually leaning into whatever privilege you might have to then leverage that privilege to support survivors. So I have a lot of class privilege. I have a lot of education privilege, and I absolutely use those things to get into certain spaces and to be able to vocalize Black women's experiences or vocalize Black women's, the barriers of Black women's face, right? I use the privilege that I have where I can, throw out those SAT words and still get to the point of we're not going to victim blame. Like, you can do all of those things in one space. And the folks, again, feel free to keep adding, what does it mean to be a good ally? How do they show up in the work? Because that can mean a lot of different things for different people. But generally, there are some ways to think about allyship and think about advocacy that can be more supportive versus others. But I wanted to also really narrow in on trauma-informed care because it's become sort of a buzzword for folks, but they don't really do it full out and like full-fledged trauma-informed care. So I will say trauma-informed care does not mean that there are no rules, no guidelines, no precedents. Like, that's not what trauma-informed care means. But what it means is that the rules and the policies and the practices that are in place are designed to be as low barrier as possible, or as least re-traumatizing as possible. They really are aimed to center the survivor's needs and realities. So trauma-informed care is an approach that is based on the recognition that many behaviors and responses expressed by survivors are directly related to traumatic incidents or experiences. The value of trauma-informed care, and really there's just so much value from it, but it creates a cultural shift from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. It assumes the survivor has a trauma history, even if you don't know their full lived experience, their entire background, you can understand that someone more likely than not has gone through or they've lived through some trauma or multiple traumas. It puts this trauma as a central issue and doesn't fall into tropes. It's not about personality. It's not about them as an individual. It's specifically about the trauma they've gone through. It meets the survivor where they are and views them as a unique person. And then it sees the trauma survivor as not sick or bad, but it's injured. And if you're injured, there's always a possibility for healing. There's always a possibility for change. And there's always the option for support. And trauma-informed care results, some of the ways I think about it is that it can improve desired outcomes. So if you're actually doing trauma-informed, survivor-centered work, survivors are more likely to continue to engage with your program. They're more likely to show up for your case management meetings. They're more likely to give you feedback on your program, actually. It supports trauma recovery by reducing re-traumatization. And see, this is the word I don't like, providing, I'll say, alternative emotional experiences, not corrective. Because again, whatever someone's natural expression, like, that's okay. And you can still model some alternative emotional experiences. So I've had plenty of survivors where ever since they were a kid, the first response from their family was violence. And so they automatically anticipated violence. So they automatically got amped up to argue and to fight. And so me, as an advocate for them or an ally with them or support in any way, I really had to make sure I was modeling behaviors that were more helpful and not getting angry and not brushing them off and not minimizing the things that they were saying. I had a survivor who was really young. She was probably 18, 19 by the time she came in, the first time she came in. And the first thing she said to me is, Ayana, I know for a fact that all Black men hit. And again, having to do a lot of modeling and providing alternative experiences of saying, I'm a Black woman, I was raised by a Black man, I have Black brothers, extended family, and those men don't hit. And to have larger conversations of, this might be your lived experience, but it doesn't mean that, it doesn't really mean that this is the only experience you can have. Yeah, I agree. I don't like that corrective, because there's nothing wrong with how you're showing up. There just might be an alternative to how you're showing up as well. And I think I missed a comment. There's a comment, I feel like TV and mass media is a constant blast of racism and sexism that I began to understand once I knew more about the history of our country. To be a good ally, I have to watch TV less so I can be centered and supportive. I also have to be careful when advocating for change in the workplace, to be clear inwardly and outwardly to others that I'm working for others, not just for myself or my comfort level. If I am clear, if I am not clear, it can appear to be you're working in favor of white privilege. And I think that's, when you think about allyship and advocacy, no matter who you are, I think the willingness to be uncomfortable or to live in discomfort for a moment is really important, because to actually be able to not put yourself in someone else's shoes, because you really can't do that, but to be able to have a higher level of empathy for what they can be experiencing, like that's why you really have to be tuned in and really understand trauma and mental health and all those things. And then it decreases our own vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue as well, because when you know more about trauma, when you understand how it presents, when you understand how it shows up, then again, it's not always about you. And when it is, you can recognize that and process it and keep going. And so thinking about, for us as allies specifically, when we get into trauma and trauma work, understanding how it impacts us as well is really important. So what in the world is secondary or vicarious trauma? Folks might have heard about it. It's sort of a buzzword that's coming up more and more as well. But vicarious trauma is experienced by when a person is continuously exposed to other people's traumatic experiences, by hearing a survivor's story and thereby standing witness to the fear and terror that survivor felt. Vicarious trauma can even lead to symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So some signs of secondary trauma look very similar to what a survivor might experience, but difficulty managing feelings, feeling jumpy or easily startled, nightmares, insomnia, overeating or undereating, impatience, overworking or absenteeism, low motivation, dreaming about survivors. I know for me, that was always something that would pop up every now and then when I was feeling really overwhelmed or really too close to certain cases. I would start dreaming about survivors or having nightmares about survivors. And that's when I really had to pull back, way far and do a lot more self-care. Detachment as well. So even detachment from family and friends, or even a rejection of physical contact or physical closeness. Compassion fatigue is actually very similar to vicarious trauma, but the main difference is that compassion fatigue impacts our ability to show empathy to others. And it really makes it difficult for us then to show empathy to ourselves, family, coworkers, and even the survivors that we serve. So again, many symptoms of compassion fatigue are similar to what survivors will experience: withdrawal, guilt, depleted energy, self-doubt, mistrust of survivors. And that's a big one to key into, because the first thing as advocates that we're taught is to trust and believe survivors. So if you're really questioning and really not believing survivors when they're telling you, that might be some compassion fatigue showing up. Loss of creativity as well. And that's really important to think about in and of itself, because you have to be creative to do this work. We know there are a lot of barriers, there's a lot of red tape sometimes. Folks, you might need to get more creative when you're doing safety planning with certain folks or folks with different identities. But again, when you lose that creativity, that's a lot of times compassion fatigue creeping up, and then fear as well. And then burnout. That's the sort of the really big buzzword now, but folks don't really know how to identify it still. Burnout is a state of physical and emotional exhaustion. It can occur when you experience long-term stress or have worked in a physically or emotionally draining role for a time. A bubble bath or a vacation won't fix burnout. Big reminder, burnout is a cumulative process, and there are many ways to disrupt the pattern that will inevitably lead to burnout, but you really have to be invested in self-care, and you really have to be around folks that can hold you accountable to your self-care as well. And this is actually the last clip. We're just gonna watch the first 7 to 10 minutes of it, and then we'll unpack and close out for today.
Years ago, I found myself standing on top of a very tall cliff, having what I would only come to recognize many years later as a near psychotic break. It would be fair for you to ask if I had always been that on edge, and the answer is no. But as many of you, I imagine, can relate to, how I found myself on top of that cliff on that particular day was by way of a very long road. Like so many others, my childhood was filled with a lot of love and many challenges. Life came into particularly sharp focus for me when I was 10 years old. My mom, who was the healthiest person any of us knew, went into a doctor's appointment for what everyone thought would be a diagnosis of pneumonia at the worst, and returned home having been told she had a very rare form of lung cancer. They gave her 3 months to live. She lived for 3 years, much of that time with one lung. And so she died when I was 13, and the sun rose and set with my mom, and I entered into my adolescence feeling if continuing to live wasn't going to be impossible, it was going to be highly improbable. So I navigated high school with a lot of overachieving. I spent my days getting straight A's and working 3 jobs, and I spent my nights planning on how I could end my life without causing my older brother, who'd always been my protector and my role model, too much pain. I did make it through high school, and then I landed in college, and I found myself sitting in one of those very large lecture halls, and my professor at the time, Professor Richard Applebaum, was talking to us about suffering on this one particular morning. In particular, he was talking about homelessness. And he was talking about it in a way that allowed time to stand still for me. He was building on what so many traditions have taught us for the beginning of time, really, that in life, it is said, there's equal measure of brutality and beauty, of pain and pleasure, of annihilating moments and of sublime moments. And yet there was a way he was talking about it, this whole conversation about equanimity, that was completely new to me. Because during those 3 years when my brother and I were taking care of our mom, we were surrounded by a number of very, very loving people and kind people who gave us a lot of support for appearing to be stoic, for seeming to be strong, and for holding it all together. And what Professor Applebaum was talking about on that morning is when one is engaged in suffering, there is so much more to it than holding it all together. So what I knew was I wanted more of whatever he had going on. So I went up to him after class, asked how I could help. He scribbled on a piece of paper the name and number of our local homeless shelter's director. And that's when I started volunteering at age 18, spending the nights regularly volunteering in a homeless shelter. I went on to work with all forms of trauma, and always within this kind of larger backdrop of systematic oppression and liberation theory. And what I knew was that I was so grateful that I had found something that made sense to me and that I felt passionate about. What I had no idea, and wouldn't know for years to come, was to what degree, having borne witness to the suffering of my mom and then the subsequent years of bearing witness to so much suffering with so many people, to what degree that was taking a toll on me. And this is something that wise people have passed down for a long time, and we know more and more about now because of the advances in neuroscience and the wonderful research that many of my esteemed colleagues are doing. But at the time, I had no idea about this cumulative toll. So one of the ways that the toll can show up is for those of you who are doing work. There are folks who do work, and as a result of the work you do, you might be exposed to things, either because of the content of what you're doing, but what a lot of my colleagues say is like, look, the work itself is the least of my concern. It's all my colleagues who put me over the edge, right? So sometimes the toll is because of the work. Sometimes the toll is because of the caretaking we do on our lives. Here she's saying, I feel like I need you less and less, Mom, now that I can make myself feel guilty all on my own. So much of the toll we feel is because many, many, many of you are caretaking in your personal lives. You're caretaking those around you. You're at home tending for folks who are returning from wars, folks who are ill, people who are in need in the community. Sometimes the toll we feel is because of the suffering of other living beings. This is Chris Jordan's wonderful work. And sometimes it's because of what's going on ecologically on the planet itself. This is the work of Vance Friedenberg. He's one of the leading scientists looking at the sixth mass extinction. But what we know is that when humans are exposed to suffering, hardship, crisis, trauma of humans, other living beings, or the planet itself, there's a cumulative toll. And there's a toll on us individually, there's a toll on your immediate relationships, there's a toll organizationally for those of you who have this exposure in your work, institutionally, systemically. We see it in movements we're a part of, we're seeing it throughout all of our communities and society as a whole. She's saying, speaking personally, I haven't had my day and I've never met any dog who has. The other piece of this that's very important, at least when I do this work, is it's always held in a larger context of systematic oppression. You know this so well, but a reminder that the degree to which you're impacted by the lives you're living and the work you're doing is intimately tied to the fact that we're in a society with so much supremacy. And if we're in a society where there's no oppression, there's no racism, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, classism, and xenophobia, so much of the suffering we are tending to wouldn't exist, and the remaining bits that exist in life, we would all be affected by that so differently. I have no doubt that all of you have so much more insight and personal awareness than I did back in the day, and that for those of you who know what this toll is and when you feel this toll, either because of what's going on in your personal lives or on the job, that you're able to identify it. But I was not at all able to identify it. So it was about 10 years into my career when a critical mass of people started kind of getting up in my face doing that, hey Laura, you're tripping, you should take some time off. And I'm sure somebody said something earlier than 10 years in, but I was very stubborn and successfully ignored them. But 10 years in is when there was a critical mass of people up in my grill really begging me to look at this. And what some of you will appreciate is that a number of those people were clients I was serving, which you can imagine is always so disconcerting. You know, survivors of domestic violence living in a shelter who can't go anywhere, begging me not to come to work. So people were doing their due diligence, right? But at the time, I was so arrogant, I was incredibly cocky, and I was entirely self-righteous. I was doing God's work. You could either step up and help me do God's work, or you could step off. But I was definitely not gonna have a conversation with you about how I was affected by my job. And like many of you possibly, I was raised in a number of traditions that implicitly and explicitly communicated, if you care enough about what you're doing, if you are down with your cause enough, if it matters enough to you, you're going to suck it up. So this whole conversation about how to sustain was not something I was engaging in. But finally, the pressure mounted, I caved. I didn't take any significant time off, but compromised, we took a short trip, went to visit our family who lived in the Caribbean. So on a particular day, we head out as a family on this hike, and we get halfway through our hike, and we summit what we wanted to summit, and there we are standing on the top of these cliffs, right? So the family's gathered around, tiny Caribbean island, standing on the top of these cliffs, looking out. The first thing I remember thinking was, this is so beautiful. The second thing I immediately thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off of these cliffs, right? And at the time I worked at Harborview Hospital, which you know is the level 1 trauma center for the whole Northwest. So it wasn't my own suicidality at play anymore. It was because of the years of bearing witness to other suffering that naturally, instinctually, one starts triaging, of course, right? So you start thinking, where would the helicopter land? Does the helicopter land on the cliff, and would you belay down to the person on the beach? Would the helicopter actually land on the beach? Is there a level 1 trauma center in the Caribbean, you ask yourself? Do they fly you to Miami? Would they stop you in customs? You know, you kind of go through the whole thing, right? So I said this out loud because I was merely presuming I was just giving voice to inevitably what was going to come up in a family conversation, because who stands on top of a cliff and does not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is. But apparently in my family, nobody was thinking that. So it got even quieter than it had been. Really long, very uncomfortable pause happened. And ultimately it was my stepfather-in-law who said, "Are you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you?" And honestly, this was the first moment I had any insight into, checking.
So if you haven't gotten there yet, that's great. But it's very easy to get there in this work, especially because the folks we tend to talk about our work with are also in this work, or they do something similar or in a similar field. So we are sort of all meshed in this work at all times. But it's really important, again, to take your sick days, to take your vacation leave, and don't answer the phone and don't answer those emails. Like, actually put up some barriers, actually put up some boundaries for folks. Like, my friends know, love my work colleagues. They are my sisters for sure, and my siblings for sure. But if I'm on vacation, don't call me. Like, we can talk about friend things, but I'm not going to talk about work things. And so it's really important that you take care of yourself in this work to then be able to show up for survivors as your best self in the healthiest way that you can. Because it's much, if you think about it, even if you're working with survivors and you're like, oh, I'm going to skip my doctor's appointment, I'm going to skip my meetings, I'm going to skip whatever, and solely be with them, at some point it's going to catch up to you, and you might be out for longer than you anticipated, or more than you want to, because you simply just haven't taken care of yourself. So again, trauma work, it's important, but it's important to, when you're being a good ally, to also do that self-investment work and do that self-care work as well. And some strategies that are useful to think about when you're trying to prevent vicarious trauma and burnout is to keep a safety plan in mind. So as much as we might safety plan with survivors, you absolutely should do it for yourself as well. Counter isolation. Make sure you're talking with folks who aren't just in the field with you. Make sure you're talking to folks from different backgrounds who can give you different perspectives and sort of bring you out of that work when you're sort of off the clock. Expand your perspective and embrace complexity. Practice active optimism and celebrate those small wins. In this work, there will be a lot of losses, to be honest. I used to have to give bad news to survivors every day, but we will also celebrate those small wins because they were meaningful still. Set and maintain clear boundaries and honor your limits. Engage in holistic self-care. And then remember to self-assess routinely. Check how and when your trauma reactions are showing up and how they're presenting. You're going to learn a lot about yourself in this work. I know I certainly did. Before getting into this work, did not know that a trigger for me was engagement with Black women in the Child Protective Services system. I did not know that. I had to go through it in my work and understand my own trauma reactions and how they would show up, and then be able to safety plan to say, all right, I know I need to be able to show up and support the survivor that I'm working with that is engaged in this system. But I also know that I need additional support. So who can be from my team with me, or who can even sit in with us in this meeting, right? So to think about what your actual needs are and how you can maneuver around it. Some styles of advocacy that are not actually empowering to victims the way we thought or the way we think they might be. The rescuer. Folks don't need a rescuer. Folks really just need support. You cannot rescue someone because you're not going to be with them for the rest of their entire life. And so what you really want to do is not rescue folks, but really set them up to get the resources and support that they can then make their own decisions. And it's really important to remember that survivors have been saving themselves since before they met you. And so to take that away from them is actually really not survivor-centered at all. The aggressive advocate, so this might be someone who says you have to leave, or you have to get a protective order, or you have to call the police, or you have to go to shelter. That's really just a reminder of the thing that they just left, or the thing that they're trying to leave. And so that's not actually useful or helpful or supportive in the way someone might think. Like, tough love is one thing, but You're there as a support, not as their family member or friend to give them tough love in that way. A smile and be nice advocate. So as smiley and as pleasant as I try to be, that alone is not helpful. Survivors need to know that you will take a stand for them, that you will push back against the status quo for them, and that you will challenge policies and practices whenever you're able to really center what their needs are. The passive and surrendering advocate. So this person is usually closer to burnout than anything, but this is the person that says, well, there's no point in helping because last time they just went back, or I really don't know if it's that serious because they really aren't engaged and they really don't seem like they care. Again, usually closer to burnout, but not helpful. And the person is there now and they're asking for services, and you should be there as an ally and as an advocate. And then the do-gooder, bleeding heart, again, very similar to the rescuer. Folks don't need to be rescued. They need to be supported, and they need to have really advocates who are willing to challenge systems and help them navigate systems and navigate resources. And then some anti-oppression principles that are useful when we think about how do we do this work and how do we do it more fully. Making sure to avoid tokenism and correcting it when it shows up. I had a supervisor early on in my shelter days who said, well, we hired you because we know you can work with the Black survivors. And I'm like, yeah, but what happens when I leave? What happens when I'm sick for a week and with the flu and can't come in? Like, does the work stop? And the fact that the community that I was in was predominantly of color, like that's pretty, like you're gonna have to learn how to work with Black folk and not just put it on the Black people to do it. White allies need to step up when other white allies need to be held accountable. Do not put all of the onus on people of color to correct. Similarly, when working with LGBTQIA community, straight cis het folks, we need you to stand up and explain some things when folks aren't understanding. Silence, to remember that for a lot of folks, silence absolutely means violence because it means when you're not speaking out against something or actively pushing against something, you're complicit in it. Do not tone police Black women. Listen fully, listen deeply. Apply trauma-informed principles and working with staff as well. That whole thing of like, leave your baggage at the door, that's not a real thing. And it actually seeps into the work in some disastrous ways, actually. Examine language and the histories behind language. Set some goals and remain thoughtful about follow-up. Don't fall into fragility, and when you do, process it and keep going. Similarly with shame, don't fall into shame. It's actually one of the biggest distractions from social justice work there is. Remember, healing is a process. It's a learning and unlearning process. It's going to take some time. Create space for conversations and continue to reevaluate if those spaces feel safe and brave, or if there are microaggressions floating around, or if there are power plays floating around. Embrace confrontation. By this, I don't mean go yell at each other in the middle of the hallway, but what I do mean is be willing to have tough conversations, be willing to push back, even when it's your friend, even when it's someone you do consider an ally. That's part of the growth process. And then, of course, change policies and practices whenever applicable, whenever possible, even if it's not explicitly racially coded, if it's implicitly racially coded, that can still be changed. If it's something that leads us to victim blaming or having skewed narratives about survivors or about people of color survivors or Black women, change it, reframe some stuff, really push back against things or policies or practices that are actually harmful for folks. And then we have about 15 minutes where I have some discussion questions, but I'll open it up to folks who might have questions or comments or feedback that they want to share with the group, or just thoughts that they want to share while I pull these questions up. And you can take yourselves off of mute or put it in the chat. So I have a question. How can you better center or situate yourselves in equity and anti-racism work? And are folks still seeing it as mission driven? Or where are you all positioned in this work? And you can unmute. So mission drift is like the concept that we are a domestic violence program and we only do domestic violence work. We don't do racial justice work. We don't even do sexual violence work. Like that's how focused some folks are with thinking about what their mission is. So I see a comment, it doesn't feel like mission drift, rather critical to mission success. All right, I love that. What else? Other thoughts?
I would just say for CAP, this is something that's been coming up at OHSU a lot in the last couple of years. Specifically, we started in 2018 and we're VOCA funded. Our focus, our scope is that traditional, sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking. But the more we have been doing this work, the more we recognize the need to have that expansion. And we have been trying very hard to, engage in a conversation that is more holistic about all forms of domination and violence. And it is one of the things I think that as an institution, OHSU is kind of, and our leadership is kind of discussing in terms of what is the scope of work that they would like CAP to do moving forward. And it's part of why we started to have these webinar series, because we think it's really integral for our community to start having conversations about, yes, maybe our lane is that traditional scope under VOCA, but because of the way that the world functions, we can't ignore all the other forms of violence that our community are experiencing. And this is why, our mission is intersectionality, is social justice, is addressing all forms of violence and discrimination that folks experience at OHSU. So I do think it is, to your question, I think that is an ongoing conversation, at least at OHSU, on whether or not that is mission drift or not, but something that I think is really important we have conversations about.
Thank you, Stephanie. I saw another comment come through. I feel like this should be embedded in the work we do as DVSV advocates, and I strive to have it as part of the work I do. Another comment, if we are meeting our survivors where they are, I think we need to include all anti-racism, etc. work. Yeah, that's always the question I've had. If you're working with survivors of color, but you're not addressing racism, how are you working with folks? Like, how are you really, like, what strategies, what resources are you offering that might be culturally humble or relevant or appropriate? Or are you offering resources that aren't all of those things? And then what's the impact for the community, right? So we talked about the fact that Black women experience incredibly high rates of violence, but aren't maybe as likely to engage with certain services or certain programs because there's not culturally responsive programming, because they're not culturally humble staff, because there are policies and protocols in place that are re-traumatizing folks. And so all of that, all of this conversation is really important to have because, again, intersectionality, all these things are related. And so when we're not talking about race and gender and class and access and all these other things, like, we're gonna inevitably miss something and miss a vital piece to somebody's case or a vital piece to somebody's really steps to safety. And then I have one last question. How can we help our staff or ourselves really as thought leaders to move past hesitancy and get to real and authentic allyship? And I know I'm just like throwing the question out there as like it's like an easy answer, but this is like sort of the just co-collaborative process of like, how do we think about what does it mean to be authentic in your allyship? What does it mean to be a thought leader? What does it mean to have and hold spaces like this, to have conversations like this? Yeah, give me your thoughts. So someone said replace them, maybe. We must be active in seeking out tools and resources and educating ourselves. We cannot expect others to relive their traumas in order to educate us in appropriate context. And I love that. And it's important to understand that simply because someone's community might have experienced it doesn't mean that they have that historical context either. There's been a lot of things that have been left out of storybooks or been left out of text that we haven't learned. Like there are a lot of Black folk that don't know about sundown towns across this country. There are a lot of Black folk that don't know about Tulsa and don't know about how Central Park got built, right? Like there are a lot of people just generally that don't know these histories, and it's been intentional. And so to do a lot of this unpacking, a lot of this growing together, a lot of sitting in uncomfortable moments and uncomfortable spaces as part of your learning process is really, really important and integral to our work. And so, and I see that other comment, I'm not gonna skip it, but I do wanna just make sure you all have my contact information, my email's here. I'll also put it in the chat. But email is the best and fastest way to get a hold of me. If you ever just wanna go over some things, just talk through some concepts or talk through some TA, I can do that, or I will support you or even connect you with folks that might be even more appropriate for that space. And I see those other comments. Promoting equity can feel like a loss to those in power. Showing how allyship is a way to flex power in a different way can be a great way to bridge the gap. Absolutely. Keep pushing leadership to recenter racial equity when DEI work groups stray. Absolutely. Get folks back on track. Say, hey, reminder, we said we're going to do this work. We said we're invested. What are we really doing? Let's create a new timeline and update some stuff. When working with other stakeholders, leaders, and departments, we try to highlight the ways that this work will positively impact them as well. Part of that meeting them where they are, or meeting them where they're at, and recognizing that sometimes unless folks think there is something in it for them or it helps the bottom line, they might not be committed to doing the work. And I mean, that's true. Like folks have to be bought in to actually care about the work. And so sometimes you're gonna have to do a little bit more work on the front end to get leadership, to get folks and also get the folks doing the direct service work to get their feedback. But really get them engaged and try to get them as excited as possible or as invested as possible into this work so that it's more sustainable. Any other thoughts, questions, feelings folks wanted to share about any of this? Again, there was a lot of information that sort of got thrown at you, a lot of things that you all have been bringing up in really great ways. I see another comment regarding something you said a minute ago. I love the idea that I can process fragility and move on. Fragility is less likely to happen when I take care of myself. Self-care sometimes feels selfish, but it makes me a better ally. It absolutely does. Like, Ayana said, don't feel ashamed. Like, oh, if somebody tries to shame you for your self-care, like that's just part of their own growth work that they have to do. It's absolutely vital to do self-care, to then actually be able to show up for survivors. And yeah, another comment, it takes strength to be able to do the right thing versus a popular thing. Yes, trans translation. Thank you all so much, all our translators. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to our team, but I really appreciate you all being in the space and being active and being dedicated to this work, and for sharing and being vulnerable and all that. Again, reach out to me if you ever need support, but thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody. It was really great presentation today. We will be sending out a recording as soon as it's available, and if you could share it with folks, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
All righty, go do your self-care. Have a great one. Rest. Thank you all so much. See you later.
Have a great one. Bye.